Hi, everyone. So a lot of the readings that we have for this class are the reserve readings. These are those PDF files that go along with the text in order to introduce us to special topics. Many of these readings are pretty straightforward. They can often be, for instance, a writing by one of the photographers who we'll be covering, which is the first of these reserve readings that you have. That's that reading by Henry Fox Talbot here. And those are fairly straightforward. But some of the readings are a little bit more theoretically complex. And just in order to clarify what I want from you, what I want you to pay attention to in these readings, and with the more theoretically complex readings to give you a little bit of a leg up to help you to understand, especially in the dense readings that have a lot to do with theory, some of the terminology in order to give you a strong base for your comprehension of these readings. I will often be giving you these little, fairly short introductory videos for the week's readings. These videos, along with the reading guide, should help you to focus in on some of the key aspects of these readings and to understand how they apply to the wider components of the class. So first off, the reading by Henry Talbot I think is pretty straightforward, and the reading guide should help you to understand what I want from you. Basically, what I'm looking for you to get from this is the different steps and, frankly, rationales that Talbot went through when he was developing this very early photographic form known as the calotype. So that one's pretty straightforward. There's not much more to say about that. However, the second reading, which is Sabine Kreibel's Theories of Photography, A Short History, is quite a bit more theoretically dense, and there are some terms that are in there that if you have never had critical theory or you haven't thought about photography or photo theory, or frankly the way that representations and signs work, and you've never been introduced to those types of questions and theories and frankly terminology, it can be pretty tough to understand right off the bat. Now, with these readings, let me just give you a caveat. These aren't the type of readings that you should be able to just kind of zip through without taking notes and understand everything in the first reading. They're readings that are really important. I think they're incredibly interesting, but you have to take good notes. You're going to have to pause every once in a while and think about what the author is talking about. You may even have to refer back to these video introductions or to look up a couple of terms online in order to get the gist of those readings. So when it comes to those types of readings, I'm going to spend some time in these videos giving you a little bit of a leg up, as I said, clarifying some of the terminology. I'm not going to do a complete overview of the reading. That's up to you, but I'm going to give you, a good foundation for them. Now, with this reading by Kreibel, it's divided into 4 separate sections, and we will be reading each one of these sections at different points along the way in the quarter. I will try to, although it's not entirely possible, to associate the different sections with different historical moments of photography in the class. Because it's so focused on theory, it's going to be one of those readings that we're going to use in order to think about the various ways that photography has been theorized, some of the complex ideas about how photography functions, different ways to value photography, and so forth. And it's part of the theory part of this class. So your first week's readings require you to read the intro and section 1 of this reading. And I'm going to give you some of the terminology that turns up here. First, I'd like to start, though, with this. It might seem right off the start that photography, when we talk about it, is self-evident. When we talk about a photograph, you're talking about that thing that we all know about. It can either be a printed off photograph, or maybe we're talking about a JPEG image or something of that sort. But it's not quite that straightforward, is it? And so right off the bat, Sabine Kreibel points out that to have any theorization of something, you kind of have to know what that something is. And you can't just be willy-nilly about it. You have to really define what the subject of your theorization is. And so, for instance, right off the bat, she asks some pretty interesting, if you would think kind of simple questions, which is, what is a photograph? What is the medium of photography? Now, a medium, by the way, if you've never taken art history, is just what something is made out of. It's kind of materiality. So, is a photograph an object? Is photography based upon that object, the photograph itself? Is photography, when we talk about it, really inclined to be thinking about not just the object, but the practice of photography, how a photograph is taken, what the artist's intentions were, if they're even considering themselves an artist. I mean, many of these people talk about themselves just as photographers. How you develop a photograph, how you circulate a photograph, is that what we theorize? Or is it possibly the function of photography that brings into the question how these images operate in the world, how they're consumed, what our perceptions of photography are, or is it some kind of combination of all of these three? Now, I want you to think about this a little bit because it really gets into how theory works. Theory is very, very specific. Theory is wanting to get into the real kind of in-depth questions about the kind of nuances of how photography functions, what its practices are, how it's consumed, and so forth. And these thinkers are really in-depth thinkers. So it will take some time to get familiar with that terminology and put yourself into a kind of philosophical mindset about thinking in depth about what photography is. So with that in mind, in addition to the reading guide that asks you to think about what photography is and some of the various theoreticians that she talks about, for instance, why did Baudelaire dislike photography? Why did Edgar Allan Poe like photography? How did Krakauer think of photography early in the 1920s? In the early 30s, this major thinker, Walter Benjamin, how did he conceptualize photography? Along with those, I want to give you some kind of key terminology here, and most of it has to do with the question of semiotic theory. Now, many people have never been introduced to semiotic theory, or semiotics, or semiology as it's sometimes called. Semiotic theory is a series of theorizations that started early on with a couple of early 20th century thinkers. One is Ferdinand de Saussure, a French thinker, and another major player early on was Charles Sanders Peirce, who started to think, how does a sign, or let's start with something, a simple sign, like a word, how come it has the meaning that it has? What secures that meaning? How do signs work? Now, the first question, I guess, on your mind would be, what do you mean by a sign? Because I'm not just talking about stop signs or something of that sort. Think of a sign as any kind of actual material thing, meaning it can't be a thought per se, that has meaning. So it can be a word, it can be a symbol, it can be a photograph, it can be combinations of photographs, and it can be any kind of combination of those things. How do these signs mean? Well, according to these semiotic thinkers, one of the key things that they proposed is that any sign is made up of two parts. And this is particular to Ferdinand de Saussure, but it gets used by many of the theoreticians that you'll be dealing with in this class. A sign, as you see on the right hand of the PowerPoint lecture screen, is made up of a signifier and a signified. These two in combination create the sign. So a signifier then are things that give a word or an image meaning, right? So it can be, for instance, a word itself or an image itself. A signified is the resultant evoked mental image or concept that you get when you see or hear a signifier. And the two together then constitute the sign, which, as I said before, is anything that conveys meaning. Now, according to semioticians, there are various different types of signs in the world that they categorize, and I'm just going to give you three big ones. The first is what is oftentimes termed a linguistic or a conventional sign. Now, a linguistic or conventional sign, and the reason, by the way, that they split these signs into different categories is to try to get into kind of parsing out what the connection is between a signifier and a signified in these various signs. I know it's a lot of terminology to try to grapple with, but I'm going to come at this in a number of different ways because it's very important for our class. In a linguistic or conventional sign, the connection between a signifier and its signified is at root a convention. It's something that needs to be learned. In other words, there are no intrinsic connections between a signifier and a signified when we're talking about a linguistic or a conventional sign. Here's a better example, perhaps. A linguistic sign, for instance, if we think about the sign itself being an apple or apple itself, the signifier is the written or spoken word apple. So when I say apple, that sound is the signifier. If you read the word apple, A-P-P-L-E, that written word would be the signifier. The resultant mental image or concept you get, apple, in your mind is the signified in this case. Now, the connection between these two in a linguistic or conventional sign is, as Ferdinand de Saussure would have said, arbitrary, or it's a matter of convention. The connection is something that is made by a society, and it's something that you need to learn. And an example to prove, the point is, think of all the different foreign languages that are out there, and all of the different words that are used as signifiers for the signified apple. So in English we have apple, in French you have pomme, and so on and so forth. These two together create the sign apple. Now I want to add one extra thing to this equation. All of these signs tend to refer to something else, right? So when I say I ate an apple this morning, what a sign really literally does is it stands in for something else. It represents something else. And that something else that it represents is its referent, an apple itself, whatever apple I ate, right? So if you're with me so far, the reason we're breaking this into parts is to think about how meaning occurs. And in this case, meaning occurs by learning that there is a connection between the word, written or spoken, apple, and a real object in the world, a type of fruit that is referred to, again in English, as an apple. It's a matter of convention. If you're thinking about, well, why do I care about this? Because, how does meaning actually happen? If I were to use, for instance, a symbol, because it doesn't just need to be a word, and I were to use a symbol and say, for instance, the peace sign. Most of you know what that is. There is no intrinsic connection between that symbol and the meaning peace. You need to learn that. And once you've learned that, you know that it's a matter of cultural convention, and it points you in the direction of trying to figure out what the cultural conventions of various signs are. The second type of sign that I want to talk to you about is what is known as an iconic sign. Now, an iconic sign is a type of sign where the connection between the signifier and its signified is at least partially based upon resemblance or visible likeness. So for instance, on your phone or laptop, the icons that you will find there often look like what they are meant to represent. If you, are searching for how to print something and you see a little picture that looks like a printer, that is an iconic sign. And it's kind of easy for me to explain now because we literally call those, in today's world, icons, right? Find the icon that will tell you about whatever kind of function you're trying to use on your phone or your laptop or whatever. But of course, it's not just on phones and laptops. They're everywhere in the world. They are visible representations that look like the thing they are meant to refer to. They're referent. But don't get confused here. Just because they are kind of visual signs doesn't mean that they're an icon. In this example that I gave you, the no smoking symbol here, there are two different types of signs. The cigarette is an iconic sign in that it looks at least partially like a cigarette. Yeah? But the red circle with the slash through it is a conventional sign in that there's nothing intrinsic about a red circle with a slash through it that means do not do this, right? You have to learn that that's what it means. And if you've ever traveled, by the way, to foreign countries and you've seen the various signs that they have up all over the place forbidding this or disallowing that, or you've tried to drive in a foreign country, you'll realize how many signs are made up of, on the one hand, iconic signs as well as conventional signs. And it is the conventional sign that you have to know the societal meaning to. Yeah? So then, this brings us to a third class of signs. These signs are what are known as indexical signs, or indexes, or indices for plural. Now, an indexical sign is a type of sign that bears an existential link between the signifier and the signified, and between the sign itself and its referent. So, for instance, fingerprints, shadows. If you watch forensic detective shows, forensic evidences, and so forth, are often theorized as being indexes in the sense that that fingerprint was created by someone touching something else. A shadow is caused by something being in between, physically, existentially in between a light source and the whatever the wall or floor or ground is on which the shadow is cast. And forensic evidence, let's say blood spatters and so forth, are indexes of something having physically occurred. In this photograph of a footprint on the moon, a very iconic photograph, the footprint is an indexical sign that someone's foot actually stepped on the moon. Now here there's a direct physical existential link between the signifier, in this case that footprint, and what it signifies, the foot actually touching the surface of the moon. Now here's where it gets kind of complex. Photographs, it is often theorized, are indexical traces of something that they represent. In other words, as I will talk about in the first lectures, A photograph is, at least in the old mechanical process of filmic technologies or photography that used some kind of photographic medium, whether it be film or sensitized paper or sensitized metal plates, the image itself is caused by light actually passing through an aperture and touching that photographic medium, imprinting it with light, right? That is then developed and produced as a photograph. So at a base level, although this is very complex, photography is oftentimes understood as an indexical mark or an indexical trace or an indexical sign, meaning there's a direct existential link between these two. But let's stop for a minute and think about this. All an index really means is that something has occurred. For instance, here, this mark of a footprint on the surface of the moon, at some level, its indexical meaning is simply that a foot touched here. In the same way that we think of a fingerprint being touched to a wall, all that indexical mark means is that someone's finger touched that wall at some point. It doesn't mean that it's a unique person that touched that wall. In this photograph, which was oftentimes circulated to show the superiority of the United States in winning the race to the moon, it's really not a symbol of America's greatness. It's only just a symbol of that foot touching things. And in the same way, though a photograph is, at least in the early days of filmic technologies, was created by light passing through an aperture and imprinting itself on the photographic medium, all it really is an index of is that that photograph was pointed at something that then was captured on the actual filmic media. Now, if you're wondering, why am I talking about all this? Because here's where it gets even more complex. The things that, of course, a photograph is able to, well, let me back here. Things that a photograph is able to capture are oftentimes objects in our world or landscapes or, people that are, in the end, representations that partake in not just the qualities of an indexical sign, meaning a physical trace of something it was pointed at, but if we look at, for instance, back at this footprint, they're oftentimes then categorized and contextualized in ways that make them conventional signs as well as iconic signs that have much more meaning to them. And if we break these down, we can say a couple of pretty interesting things. Roland Barthes is one of the key characters who was a theoretician of photography who is referenced in the Kribel reading, who will turn up a number of times over the course of the quarter. And Roland Barthes, talking about photography, he was a semiotician as well, once pointed out that this quality of the photograph being an index has with it a kind of resultant reality effect. When we look at something that appears to us as if it is objective, that it's just that mechanism of the camera pointed at something that it captures, we oftentimes are drawn into the reality of the photograph. We think this is real, right? The photograph is real. The photograph can't lie. It is what he called the reality effect, to give you the sense that it's not really reality. It's a very particular representation of reality that nonetheless catches us up in its mythology, in its believability. Now, one of the ways he referred to this, and it's a much more complex idea than I'm rendering here, is he called that feeling of being there the punctum, the component of a photograph that pierces us, that makes us feel like we are back in that moment in time, seeing that scene of the photograph as the photographer saw the scene, him or herself. Yeah? He once called this a message without a code, or an empty envelope, as if you're seeing something that is just a little kind of snapshot or component of reality without it being a sign at all, as if it were just the thing in itself. But then he went on to add a second term to this. He said that photographs simultaneously also have a component to them that he called the studium. And the studium are all of the conventions that go along with reading photography. We call all of these conventions, and they can be ways of thinking about photography, what has been written about photography, understandings of its practices, all of the things that kind of make up the way that we conceive of photography, the discourses of photography. So what he was getting at is that on the one hand, photographs come across to us as something that just seemed like a little piece of reality that's totally objective. But on the other hand, of course, they are absolutely shot through with significance. They are visual signs, very complex visible and visual signs that we need to decode and really kind of take apart. And so in this little diagram that I put here, what he pointed out is that semiological systems, the sign itself, doesn't just stop at one order. For instance, an apple, that word gives you the mental image or signified of apple, and together they create this sign. But you might also use an apple in order to signify something else, a second order semiological system that Roland Barthes called myth or mythology, in order to point out that there's nothing based upon really reality here or the way things actually are, but rather that photography and any other sign can be used in order to convey a meaning that at basis is ideological, that is informed with an intention to make you think of something else. And he called this level mythology. So in other words, an apple, the sign apple, can be used to signify something that isn't just the fruit apple, but for instance, in this photograph that I give you here, the idea of sin or temptation. I mean, in this case, putting an apple in the hand of a beautiful woman with sultry, smoky eyes looking at you this way, biting into the apple, can't help but partake and refer to various other cultural conventions and symbols that exist in our world that signify, in this case, temptation or sex, going all the way back to the original kind of moment, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but also used over and again in photography and used in painting and used in advertising. In other words, we have an apple, but that apple is being used as a symbol of something else, and this endless chain of semiotic meanings can occur and make photographs all about ideological messages. Well, again, think about these things. Try to conceive in your own mind different types of signs than the examples that I gave you. Can you think of other types of conventional or linguistic signs? What are some other symbols? Can you think of various iconic signs? And can you think of other types of indexical signs that are out there that have this kind of really powerful reality effect, making us think that there is no ideology here, it's just reality? And then finally, can you think about beneath all of these indexical signs and all of these iconic signs, and by the way, I should have said this, a photograph is, by its very nature, not just kind of erstwhile an indexical sign, it's always an iconic sign, isn't it? It always looks like, unless it's very abstract photography, the thing that it represents. And of course, what Roland Barthes wanted to say is, at basis as well, they are all very conventional signs. They partake of meanings that already exist in the world, that get attached to them through visual association or through allusions and so forth, that have these really powerful meanings. Well, hopefully that'll give you a little bit of a kind of foundation for going into the first series of theoretical writings on photography, and along with that reading guide, help you to get the most out of this class.